Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And this afternoon, we'll be looking at the relationship between U.S. and China, not in terms of the potential for adversarial relationship, but in terms of the potential for collaboration on climate change. We'll be doing that with the director of our Asia program, Jacques deLisle, whom many of you know, who's the Stephen A. Cousin Professor of Law, Professor of Political Science, and Director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. His next book, which I will mention, Taiwan Under Tsai, co-edited with our other fellow, one of our other fellows, June Teufel-Dreyer. That's coming out this spring, very soon. If you have questions, we'll be going to those questions about halfway through the program. And so put them in the Q&A box, not the chat, put them in the Q&A box. We will be recording this so that if you missed any of it or want to hear it again or want to send it, refer to it to your friends, by all means, it will be on FPRI's YouTube channel. I'd also like to give a shout out to our supporters, our board, and our members who may be online. Thank you again for your support. These programs are free to you, but not free to us. So we do very much appreciate the support. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Jacques.
Well, thank you, Raleigh, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It's a great pleasure to welcome to our series on U.S. China relations and China in the world, Alex Wang, professor of law at the University of California, Los Angeles Law School. And he's really, to my mind, one of probably the best person writing on Chinese environmental law and politics these days. He's worked on the social effects of law and its interaction with institutions in China, the U.S. China dimension of this relationship, a lot on China's legal framework and bureaucratic structures for dealing with environmental issues and how they figure into Chinese politics more generally. So in addition to being a quite accomplished academic, he also had time on the ground in Beijing for quite a while. Before 2011, he was a senior attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council's office in Beijing, which was a really rare beast, a US-centered environmental NGO operating in China. It's become a much tougher thing to do these days. And he worked in that capacity with China's government agencies, its legal community, and environmental groups and civil society to improve environmental rule of law and to strengthen the role of the public in environmental protection in China. He has a JD from NYU and a BS in biology from Duke University. He's a member and former fellow of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Advisory Board to the Asia Society's Center on U.S. China Relations. And last but not least, he's one of about 20 younger scholars involved in our project on the future of U.S. China relations, being run out of our China Center at Penn with support from FPRI. He's written widely in these fields. I'll just mention a couple of titles of major articles: Symbolic Legitimacy and Chinese Environmental Reform, Explaining Environmental Information Disclosure in China, Climate Change Policy and Law in China, Chinese State Capitalism and the Environment, and the Search for Sustainable Legitimacy, Environmental Law and Bureaucracy in China. As you'll see, those all speak a lot to the kinds of topics we've got on the table today, which is essentially the US-China relationship on the environmental front as we head into the Biden presidency. So Alex, we could start with a little bit of background here. Probably obvious to everybody, but worth underscoring the point why the US and China are so important on climate change issues, why the relationship between the two of them is so vital to addressing the problem.
Great. Thanks a lot, Jacques. Can you all hear me okay? Great. So thanks for having me here, first of all. And I should note that this topic we're covering today has been discussed quite a lot over the last few months. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation and hope that I can contribute something to this. So to start off with a little bit of the background, the reason we're talking about this obviously is because the U.S. and China are the largest emitters of greenhouse gases in the world, right? China right now accounts for about 30% of global emissions. The U.S. somewhere around 13%. And so what the U.S. and China do on emissions is tremendously important. But relevant to our discussion today also is that obviously China and the U.S. are also major consumers in the world. They're also major sources of innovation and technological advancement. So these are things that generate emissions, and also the innovation and technological advancement side will be key to the sort of industrial and economic transformation that will be needed to solve the problem. And so what happens in these countries is tremendously important in that regard as well.
Sorry, I'm being slow on the unmuting button there today. So there's been sort of a an on-again, off-again history of U.S. China cooperation in this area, right? So we go back to the Conference of Parties at Copenhagen, where the Obama delegation kind of crashed the meeting with Chinese leaders on how to deal with climate change. We have some really pretty impressive bilateral, at least moves toward coordination and cooperation as we headed into Paris, which was, to a significant degree, the Paris Accords reflected U.S. China getting together on some of these issues. And then Trump withdrawing from the Paris Accords, we have a lot of friction, very little cooperation in the last few years. And then we have now what is a generally fraught U.S. China relationship, but where the Biden administration has identified really a pretty small handful of areas where they see hope for cooperation, and climate's been one of them. So can you take us through a little bit how that pendulum is back and forth, and what kind of hope we have going forward?
Sure. So, for people who don't follow this regularly, it's worth just noting that the international negotiations over climate really date back to the early 90s with the creation of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which came into force in 1994. If you follow China, China's engagement since then, from then to now, follows a somewhat familiar trajectory, right? That mirrors a lot of the ways that China is engaged in other areas like trade and lots of different international areas, which is that initially they participated, but they were really in a learning mode in the 1990s. And they didn't become more active in the negotiations really until the run up to the Copenhagen meeting in 2009 and the years leading up to that. So China submitted its first National Climate Action Plan to the UN system in 2007 in the run up to the Bali meeting, COP13. The COP is the Conference of Parties, the sort of the meetings of the parties of the agreement to negotiate. And so in the run up to Copenhagen, China became more active. And you may recall that the period of Copenhagen was quite contentious, right? If you think of the context then, the news of China surpassing the U.S. as becoming the leading emitter in the world had just the news of that had just come out a few years earlier, and the U.S. was attempting to get China to commit to binding commitments of some sort. China at that time was very insistent on a position of common but differentiated responsibilities, which sort of means developed countries should take on responsibilities, and the developing countries who were less able in capacity and less responsible historically for climate emissions should be involved in the effort, but have fewer responsibilities. And so there was a big battle at the time during Copenhagen, very contentious. China's had representatives from their foreign ministry. Vice Minister He Yafei was very combative. You might remember that there was a lot of press about him calling Todd Stern, the U.S. negotiator, saying that I don't want to say the gentleman is ignorant, or calling him irresponsible or lacking in common sense, and that sort of thing. And at the time, just to give you an example of the position that China had at that time, they had a single official side event. At these COP events, there are lots of different side events, and the countries will have official side events. China's official side event was the presentation from state researchers of a study of sort of a historical budget of emissions. And the conclusion was that because the US and the EU had substantial historical emissions, that they had essentially used up their global allocation of emissions. And developing countries like China had a lot of room to grow, and that China would take on commitments if essentially the U.S. and China sort of paid and helped to do that. And so those negotiations essentially broke down into what was largely considered to be a failure. No real agreement, very soft sort of statements that came out of that. There was a famous article that came out by Mark Linus saying, "How do I know China wrecked the Copenhagen deal? I was in the room." And on the issue of China, how they dealt with the international negotiations, I would say Copenhagen was sort of a wake-up call for China. I don't think China was ready for the amount of attention and scrutiny. I recall I was there with NRDC. I see my former boss Barbara Finnemore on the line. She and I were there as part of the NRDC team. We would regularly go to the China press room, and the daily press briefings for China were just a scrum, packed, completely overflowing. They had sort of these low temporary walls. People were literally climbing over the edges of the walls to try to get into the room. And I think it just showed that China didn't expect that level of day-to-day, even hour-to-hour scrutiny. And they were taken a little bit aback. And they really were taking a defensive approach at that time. And what you've seen since then is that China has shifted to a much more proactive, affirmative stance in environmental policy in general, and in the way they engage in these COP meetings, right? So these days, if you go to a COP meeting, China has a very well-organized, almost continuous flood of global experts and Chinese experts coming in and talking about what China is doing, different studies that have come out. And there's a lot of room for engagement with the public, and it wasn't the sort of more passive approach in Copenhagen. And that approach also dovetails with what was going on within China, right? Which was a turn that had already begun at the time of Copenhagen, right? China, at that time in their 11th five-year plan, had started to bring out targets on energy efficiency, pollution reduction, and these types of things. But really, in the years since, leading up to now, you saw a commitment to what the Chinese officials were calling ecological civilization. This was the framing term for their entire environmental program. There was a lot of attention to air pollution. I'm sure everyone has seen the pictures, and just a recognition that the environmental problem was at crisis levels. And there was a sort of typical top-down, technocratic, campaign-driven approach to tackling particularly air pollution. And also, there's a lot of overlap, obviously, with climate and air pollution policy, but also pushing forward on climate policy. And then you get into the years before the Paris Agreement, which was the Paris meeting was in 2015. And so when we talk about climate cooperation, a lot of this is framed in terms of what happened during the Obama years, right? So the cooperation that happened then was the U.S. and China getting together and making some joint announcements about what they were going to do, that they were committed to a global agreement and that they were going to take major actions on climate change. So in advance of the Paris meeting in December of 2015, in 2014, Obama and Xi had a joint announcement. And then in 2015, they also had another joint announcement announcing a lot of initiatives, targets, and these sort of things. And this cooperation was widely credited with helping get the nations of the world together on the Paris Agreement, right? And largely, you had just about everybody, all the countries of the world signed on to the Paris Agreement. And for those who aren't familiar with the agreement, it's worth just noting that the nature of that agreement was a different beast than the Kyoto Protocol that came before it, which was very much strictly bifurcated between developed and developing countries, right? With the developed countries having targets and developing countries like China not having targets. The Paris Agreement was meant to have broad participation, right? You wanted everyone in, but the commitment was in a way shallow, right? It was a procedural commitment to submit to the procedural process of Paris, right? So everyone would submit something called NDCs, nationally determined commitments, contributions, and they would submit essentially what they had decided they were able to do on climate change. You may or may not know that the way this was supposed to work was it was a pledge and review system, that you would get everyone in, you would pledge, and then you would have procedures, check-in points, and then opportunities to push people to make bigger pledges, more ambitious pledges. And presumably technology and economic dynamics would have shifted in the intervening years to make it progressively easier to achieve those goals. So this year is the first year in which it's been delayed because of COVID, but where countries are meant to submit their next series of plans. So some countries have already, and many have not. And so the meeting, COP26 in Scotland later in late November this year should be a big moment to see how this kind of ratchet effect works. But that to just finish the history, right? We know that Trump then essentially was very oppositional to climate action, and there was largely no state-to-state climate cooperation. And Trump famously pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. But obviously now with Biden in, we have the opportunity for cooperation. And so this is all a very long-winded way to sort of get us to the point where we are now, which is the last few months there's been a lot of debate about whether we have cooperation again. Are things different because of the way relations have gone south and become much more tense? And concerns about China's rise are sharper than they ever have been, and so we can talk about that. But I'll turn it back over to you for the next question, Jacques.
Well, thanks. It's a terrific overview of how we got where we are. But as you say, one of the areas where the Biden administration has signaled a possible departure from the Trump administration is on climate policy generally, and amidst what is still a fairly tough line toward China, pointing out or sort of singling out climate change is an area of possible cooperation. So what do you see as getting in the way? Clearly, we at one point did have a shared view of the need to do something, but there's quite a laundry list of things that might impede cooperation. How would you weight the various factors? Things like the U.S. domestic politics of dealing with China, the broadly rivalrous relation between the U.S. and China. What's your laundry list, and what's the worst?
Right. Well, so one of the issues that's already cropped up in the Beltway debate is, whether the desire of the U.S. to cooperate on climate change will lead it to be soft on China in all of the other areas of conflict, human rights, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South China Sea, cybersecurity, trade, and these sorts of issues, right? And it's been an argument that's penetrated enough that John Kerry actually responded to it at a press conference and said, no, we will not do that. We will not be soft. And then for the Chinese side, for their part, have also lobbed sort of different mixed signals, right? The wolf warrior diplomat Zhao Lijian came out and said, there are red lines. If you want to cooperate, you can't be, pushing us on these other areas. Whereas other officials have come out in a much more conciliatory, cooperative mode, kind of playing a good cop, bad cop kind of thing. So we don't know exactly how that will play out. But what's true is that the appetite for a more confrontation with China on the areas that are sharper is just higher than before, right? The median kind of attitudes towards China has moved in a more hawkish direction in the last few years, and we know that, right? So these issues were there prior to Trump, right? If you talk to officials at that time, it was the similar dynamic. Climate change could be an area for cooperation even amidst all of the tension points. But I think there will be pressure in some areas of cooperation will be relatively untouched, I think. So it's worth unpacking what we mean by cooperation and coordination. I think that's been something that's been a little bit missing from the debates about cooperation. So let's try to list some of the things that we're talking about when we say cooperation, and whether those things, do we think those things are necessary right now or essential, right? Or could we get by even or move forward on climate change even if the cooperation and coordination is not possible, right? So I think on the easier side is technical cooperation and perhaps business engagement, right? So the technical cooperation is, sharing policy ideas, doing joint research, officials, civil society groups, academics, getting together to talk about how to solve the problems of climate change, right? And these days, most people may know that a lot of the discussion is orienting towards how do you create a pathway towards carbon neutrality. And then that becomes a very technical exercise in some way. What industries or what sectors do you tackle? Where do you have the right technologies? Where don't you have the right technologies? And then you sort of put the puzzle pieces together. And that kind of cooperation has been going on. It's the type of work that I did at NRDC and continue to do it at UCLA. And even in the sort of nadir of the Trump years, that kind of work continued and didn't feel all that different from before, even though the top level conflict was so much sharper. And on the business side, my sense is that the business deals, to the extent they make sense from a business perspective, the business deals in the area of clean tech can go on, and the business people will do the business deals in the way that they see fit and appropriate. But there are other areas that are more challenging, right? So if we imagine, could there be a kind of joint announcement for greater ambition in the way that happened in the run-up to Paris? It's not clear, right? Given, today we're having this meeting on a day when U.S. and China are meeting the administrations are meeting for the first time in Alaska, right? And so climate change is supposed to be on the list, but all of these other tension points we mentioned are also supposed to be on the list. So in that context, where both sides are kind of drawing sharp red lines, would the world lead, would Biden and Xi get up together at a podium and announce kind of joint climate targets of greater ambition to try to encourage the rest of the world to go for greater ambition? It's not clear, but it's also not clear that that's what's necessary right now, right? That was certainly very necessary in the run-up to Paris because we were trying to get a global agreement, trying to get everyone together, and it was important, just each side making their own announcements and trying to show that each side is capable of greater ambition. And we'll get into, we're going to talk later about sort of the competitive dynamics and the role that plays. But I think this is one of those areas where there is a sort of background battle going on of, which governance model works, right? Or which is legitimate. This what you've called in the past kind of ideational rivalry. And this is partly at play. And so there's an incentive for each side to just simply make an ambitious pledge to show that their system is capable of delivering on something that the world wants. And whether cooperation is essential there, it's not clear to me that it is essential. I'll just list a few other areas that I think matter here. Another area is in the area of U.S. and China engagement with other countries, right? So development finance, aid to other countries, right? One of the things that certainly the Biden administration is pushing forward on is the need to rebuild alliances that were fractured during the Trump years. China, for its part, has been making tremendous progress on building alliances, right? In my China and the International Legal Order class, we talk a lot about China engagement with the UN, and you see the fruits of their alliance building in UN votes on various resolutions and these sorts of things. And so China has made great progress. The US wants to rebuild those, and you can see that there will be a battlefield in terms of climate-oriented finance, right? The Biden administration has already said, well, we are not going to finance coal and fossil fuels, and we want to invest in green development aid and finance. China has been criticized for financing and supporting dirty technologies, coal, heavy industry, those sorts of things. And so how this plays out will matter a lot to our future, right? If there can be some sort of cooperation, sort of a agreement from both sides to not finance dirty industries, you could see, and then competing on the green technologies, that would be a good outcome. And then the sort of competition is constrained. But there could also be a sort of race to the bottom in the sense. There's already been discussion in some quarters about, what if the U.S. steps out of dirty technology financing and China continues to do that? And if the local actors want the coal plant or the polluting plant, doesn't that just draw those countries more into the Chinese orbit and prevent the U.S. from achieving its alliance building goals? And then two other areas I'll mention really quickly is a big area is in the area of trade. What happens with the trade war, right? So there's evidence that the trade measures are already slowing the growth of some clean technology areas. So solar tariffs have raised the price of solar in the United States and have slowed down the deployment of solar, right? So solar panels are, one source I saw said that they're 80% more expensive than in Europe and Japan, and that solar systems in general are 30% more expensive than before. And there's also the area of where does, to what extent does U.S. politics towards China drive heavy policy shifts in the name of security to block certain companies from engaging in China? For example, there was a measure to block Chinese EV bus technologies and train technologies in U.S. domestic systems. And so to what extent does that slow deployment, or can there be some sort of agreement that allows us to resolve the trade conflict while not tamping down or blocking the achievement of the environmental goals? So I'm not a trade expert, but I've read probably the best thing I've read on this is there's an article by Mark Wu, who was at Harvard, is now in the administration, and my colleague Jim Salzman on green trade conflicts, right? And so one of the things they propose in their article is that on the trade measures front, you could channel some of the tariff funding into rebates for U.S. Purchasers in a way that helps the environmental goals, doesn't make the technology so expensive that it slows down deployment, but it also allows the countries to work out the trade disputes. And then just the final area I'll mention on this is this issue of keeping fossil fuel resources in the ground, oil, coal, these sorts of things, right? So if we go forward aggressively to try to reach carbon neutrality in 2050 or 2060, which is where all of the countries are now orienting their goals, there will be a need to keep fossil fuel resources in the ground. And how does this play out in the coming 10 years or 20 years, particularly if China is a little bit slower, right? Their modeling has shown that they're going to be a little less aggressive for the next 10 years. And let's say the Biden administration pushes the U.S. more aggressively. How does the sort of battle over energy security, the control over energy resources play out? And does there need to be some sort of cooperation and coordination to agree to kind of a fossil fuel non-proliferation agreement, to agree to keep resources in the ground to prevent friction on the energy resources, energy security front? So I would love to hear from people in the audience on their thoughts on this, because I think this is the area we really need to work out the details, right? Because we could say cooperation is great, coordination is great. I think on the trade areas, development, finance, there's kind of security-based limits on technology investment. There's going to be a lot to work out, and those are the areas that will most sharply raise this issue of are you going to have to make trade-offs among priorities in order to, say, achieve climate goals? Would you soften tariffs, for example? Or can you achieve both? Can the U.S. in particular achieve both of those prongs through smart policy construction and these sorts of things? I will make a pitch. This may be a premature pitch, but Michael Davidson, a professor at UCSD, has recently kicked off an effort to just exactly to look at some of these issues, like on the trade and the security-based limits on investment that I'll be involved in and some others are involved in. So we're going to be researching those issues across this year.
Okay, thanks. A lot to chew on there. We do have some questions starting to come into the Q&A chat. I encourage other people out there with questions to put them in. Let me just pick up on a couple of threads and I'll weave in some of the questions from the Q&A box. So I mean, I take your point very much. There's been this concern that we'll sell out other issues to get Chinese cooperation on climate change. That strikes me as probably not terribly likely, except maybe in some trade areas where there are going to be other motivations perhaps for doing it. And I very much agree with this notion that that actually the generally sour tenor of the relationship may get in the way of some forms of cooperation. So sort of the opposite kind of spillover effect leads to less cooperation. And so follow-up question is that is one of the arguments that some make about the possible reinvigoration of U.S. China climate cooperation, which, as you pointed out, hardly ever fully went away. But there's some hope that if the Biden administration moves forward toward more expansive cooperation or better vibes around the cooperation, that it could have a positive spillover effect to other aspects of the relationship. So that kind of linkage. Do you see that happening?
So I think it's possible, but I've never been in government, so I don't know exactly how that would play out. But my sense is that, as it always seems to have been, that you have these different areas and they have their own dynamics, right? And so I think it certainly changes the tenor of the relationship if you're able to cooperate on something, right? And that helps build relationships. And I think in particular, what I'd like to see it do is tamp down on the possibility of overreach, right? Arguably, you've seen in the name of security or this rivalry, there's the risk and the reality of demonizing too much and going overboard in ways that block the achievement of policy goals that we actually want to achieve, right? So if you create a caricature of what China is, recognizing that there are real risks there, but overreach can block the things that we actually want to achieve, right? So I think that's where we need to be very careful going forward. And I think the risk of that is already declining in this administration, but it's still there, so for sure.
I think one of the other interesting points that I want to get lost in the number of issues that have been raised here is the prospect of, particularly in the BRI context, Belt and Road Initiative context, of China funding things in other countries or being involved through its enterprises in other countries that add to our climate change problem. In a way, it's a modern day replay of the on whose account do you put the polluting and greenhouse gas emitting things. So China's argument and developing countries' argument back in the common but differentiated responsibilities era. Part of that was, well, it's polluting factories for making goods that are consumed in Europe and the US, so that's on you guys, not on us. Right. We're going to have this problem putting it on China if it's funding these kinds of projects.
Right. Yeah, that's a really important point to raise, right? Because the studies suggested that 30% or so of Chinese emissions were in the name of producing things that were exported to largely the US and Europe. And we should recognize also that China now is going through that process of exporting polluting industries, just as the EU and Europe did in the past.
Okay, so we have some focused questions in the Q&A part that I'd like to get into. So some of them are kind of, I guess, would say almost industry or company specific. So let me just throw a couple of them out to you. You can see them on your screen as well. One is one way to deal with the greenhouse gas problem is next generation nuclear power plants. And so Lawrence Husick is one of our senior fellows here, raises the question about what's going to go on that front. Bill Gates has this startup on next generation nuclear power technology. It was going to be doing something in China, and it appears to have perhaps gotten whacked by some of the broader problems to the relationship. So what are those kinds of impediments to areas where we might see technical cooperation? And then there's another question about some of the big sources of greenhouse gases, which is making cement and steel, which of course China does a lot of. And if the US does a big infrastructure bill, we're going to need to get that from somewhere. So I guess across those industrial sectors, next generation nuclear to old school, at least with recent technology, highly greenhouse gas emitting steel and cement. Any chance of
Yeah.
what do you see happening?
Well, on the nuclear front, I'm not an expert on nuclear. My the position of a lot of the people I work with has been to say, look in different directions than nuclear because of the cost and the waste issues. But there are people making the argument that that with new technologies and essentially the climate crisis, that there's a need to look at the new technology. So I'm open to those arguments, but I can't say that I'm expert enough to make a judgment on that. But I'm cautious on nuclear, just because I'd rather focus our attention on efficiency, on wind and solar, on these types of things, and there's a lot that can be done in those areas without having to dive into the nuclear area. On the area of steel and cement, what do you do on heavy industry is still a difficult problem. Right? If you think of the different areas, right? Industry is one where there are not good answers yet, right, on the technology, right? So in transport, electric vehicles and the electricity sector with wind and solar and batteries and that sort of, we're more in the deployment mode where we have technologies that are viable, and a lot of the effort is trying to get those things out into the world and in operation. Industry, there's a lot of work to be done to make commercially viable and sort of commercially viable technologies, and so a lot of that will require investment in the research and really industrial policies that support that, right? And so it's interesting to note that industrial policy in the United States now may not be such a dirty word as it has been in the past, right? Obviously China has been wholeheartedly embracing industrial policy, and that's actually led to a lot of the trade conflicts and that sort of thing. But I think there's an appetite now, given the state of the climate crisis and the opportunity to create jobs out of it, to use industrial policy to promote technological development and industrial development in the U.S. And so, and this is a direction that is being taken in Europe as well. And so, so I think whether there can be collaboration on that, to the extent that it's the technical collaboration that we've talked about, I don't see why not, right? That kind of stuff is ongoing right now. Right, and one thing we should also know is on the technical cooperation front, the U.S. and China at the national level have already begun to dip their toes into this, even though we're still talking about the U.S. China conflict. Right, there was news that Janet Yellen announced that at the G20, U.S. and China were going to co-chair a panel looking at financial risks related to climate. Right, so that's the kind of thing that we've had a lot of, and we're going to see a lot more going forward.
So I think one of the other threads that runs through a couple of those questions that I tried to wish together there is the degree to which promising areas of cooperation are going to get scuttled by concerns about controlling loss of technology, leakage of technology, and perhaps tit for tat retaliation. So one of the questioners points to the possibility that Trump's tariffs prompted the cancellation of one of Gates's ventures. And so how much do you see what would be a sensible approach in terms of technical cooperation, perhaps even in terms of what companies want to do, but in comes the politics of it, right? The securitization of the tech sharing and the using the sort of political retaliatory tools to get in the way of some areas of cooperation.
Yeah, so I mean that's a great question, and it's the area in which there's the most uncertainty and that where we have the least clear answers. I mean, I would say as an initial matter that the most important thing is actually for each country to overcome the domestic political barriers to climate change action, right? We know we're well familiar with the barriers in the U.S. In China, there are similar dynamics where vested interests that would be hurt by the shifts required by a move to carbon neutrality are opposing this, right? And so this is why in China you're seeing still having the build out of coal-fired power plants at the local level and this sort of thing. But the possibility of what you just described and what the questioner asks about is completely there. And I think part of the answer is to not make everything dependent on the cooperation and just to recognize that that may happen. And then the positive cooperation and the constructive competition and cooperation is a way to try to, the relationship building that comes as part of that is a way to try to mitigate the possibility of the tit for tat, right? I think during the Trump administration, you had a lot of, I would consider destructive tit for tat, right? You just make an announcement and it just leads immediately to an equivalent announcement on the other side. And arguably neither side it's a sort of death spiral where neither side is really achieving its own goals. And so I don't think this is an easy area, right? It's going to be a tightrope act, and far be it from me to give any sort of easy answer on that.
So another questioner raises the point about state-owned enterprises in China. Of course, in China's domestic activities that produce greenhouse gases, state-owned enterprises are major players. And as China goes out into the world building some of these things, whether it be Belt and Road or more broadly, a lot of large state-owned enterprise role. And as you well know, how to think about state-owned enterprises is something that bedevils anybody who looks at Chinese political economy and foreign policy. To some extent, they're profit-seeking enterprises. To some extent, they're more tied in to state actors and policies, and really kind of and there's substantial diversity among them. So, do you see any particular problems or opportunities that come from the relatively large role of SOEs in China's climate change impact?
Yeah, so I've written a little bit on this, but my thinking of this is really informed by the great scholarship by a number of other people. I think one piece that I found very helpful was a piece by Curtis Millhaupt and Wentong Zhen, where they frame how to think about state-owned enterprises and private companies in China. And the short answer is, the state has less control over the state-owned enterprises than is commonly supposed, and the private enterprises are much more embedded in the state than is commonly supposed. So there's this dynamic where the state is involved, but also it doesn't have complete control. Another piece that I thought was very helpful in thinking about this was my colleague C.K. Lee, a UCLA sociologist here, did some great work on comparing Western capital and Chinese state-owned capital in Africa. I can't remember the country offhand, maybe Zambia. But what was interesting about that was to sort of highlight the problems that arise out of two different logics of capital, right? The Western capital would enter and would tend to exit very quickly if commodities prices changed. The Chinese capital was not the best on labor and working conditions and these types of things, but was tended to be less market influenced, essentially. Like they valued some of these the relationships with the state and infrastructure building and these types of things in a way that was arguably motivated in part by state policy. And so those dynamics, we just have to understand them as we're thinking about state-owned enterprises as they go out in the world. And I think right now that Chinese finance and Chinese enterprises going out in the world it's a problem for climate change, right? There's been a lot written about the investment in dirty industry. There is also investment in green technologies, and there obviously needs to be more of that. And there needs to be really a ban on investment in the dirty industries, right? If we want to meet these very ambitious global climate targets, that has to be the way it goes, right? And so to achieve that, if we know that the Chinese state doesn't have full control over these enterprises, we recognize how difficult that task will be. But we also recognize that they will be responsive. The enterprises are responsive to state policies signals emanating out of Beijing, even as the enterprise try to shape those goals to favor their own interests, right? We understand that, and we need to just use those dynamics to try to achieve the climate goals that we're interested in.
Yeah, so we're not providing a terribly satisfactory answer, but I think that's absolutely fair. We have one layer of question of how much are SOEs doing their own thing for pursuing their own economic interests versus how much they're responsive to state policy. And there's some, I think, complexity in the policy signals they're getting from the state. On the one hand, the order is to be green, and there was a rebranding of the Belt and Road Initiative to be sustainable development in response to some of the criticisms that Alex was pointing out. On the other hand, there's this go out, get there, get market share, and help China's relationships with the recipient countries, some of which aren't terribly concerned. At least the leadership of those countries isn't terribly concerned in the short run. And when you've got imperfect control and somewhat mixed signals, it gets to be very messy to steer these things. All right, so we've got some other questions here. So one of the other questions, which gets back to some of the domestic politics, and as we've just been discussing, SOEs are part of the domestic politics in China. That is, those who have an economic interest, perhaps, in not being so green. We've talked about the anti-China vibe that affects U.S. options. But another question is, if you go green, there's always a concern about job losses. Maybe not net job losses, but certainly job losses in certain sectors. What do you see happening in both countries on that front? And is there any room for a cooperative approach there? Or do we just each have to address it as best we can around?
Yeah, so the reality it's an issue in both countries, right? And there's a hot debate about it in the U.S. and the argument in favor of the transition is that you invest heavily in these new industries and you create new jobs rather than clinging on to jobs in declining industries, and that's the argument. But obviously, the implementation is not easy. I think what's clear in the U.S. is that in the past, the approach by either party has not been very successful, right? I think Republicans have tended to throw it to the market. The market will take care of it. Democrats have focused on job training and those types of things, but they haven't really worked very well. And you've had a lot of communities that have really suffered from this, right? And so, it seems to me that the Biden administration's policies are overtly considering these issues, right? And thinking about middle class and lower class issues and the need to address those. And so again, there's no clear answer here, no easy answer, but I think just investing in the transition and being willing to put policy and funds behind it is the key. In China, it's a similar dynamic. The state has been managing these types of transitions for a long time. Most famously in the 90s with throwing a lot of people off of state roles, right? Arguably the transition on coal involves a lot fewer jobs, right? And in many ways, the transition is already happening, whether, like with the coal industry in the US, the transition is already happening in that automation and other factors and just market dynamics are leading to a lot of millions of coal jobs already being lost in the last few years. So to the extent that people are framing it as a reason to move or not towards green policies, I think that question is already answered, right? It's already happening. And so the question is, how do you deal with it? One way you deal with it is try to create new jobs in other industries. And otherwise you manage safety net and that sort of thing for the people that lose their jobs. So again, I think the basic message though is that just transition issues, which is the term that's often used, are critical, and they need to be front and center as we make these transitions, because we're talking about for many sectors, it won't necessarily involve wrenching change, but for some sectors, it will, right? So if you fundamentally are not using oil or coal anymore, for people in those sectors, it's quite a dramatic change.
We're starting to get near the end of our time here. There are a couple of largish topics I want to turn to before we wrap it up. But before that, we got a question from Tom Gold, whom you know well, a sociologist up at Berkeley, works on China.
Sure, yeah.
He essentially wants to take you back to your days in Beijing. That is, what about the possible role of NGOs, international environmental NGOs, on their own and in collaboration with Chinese counterparts and gongos, the government organized, that occupy a lot of that space in China?
Yeah. So the NGOs, the environmental NGOs, the international environmental NGOs remain quite active in China, and NRDC, thanks to Barbara Finnemore, was one of the earliest actors in the space. But since then, just about every major, American and European environmental group has at least a project, if not an office, in China, and that's kind of what I'm talking about when you think about, that kind of work just continued, a lot of people at the working levels who are engaged and have long-term relationships, and a lot of informal relationships where they can just reach out with questions and deal with issues that come up. So I think that's a good dynamic. The other issue that's raised by the question is, what is the role of civil society at all in this transition, right? And we know that the Chinese approach has been very top-down, technocratic, campaign-driven implementation and enforcement. And certainly the domestic NGOs have been pushed into a narrower space for collaboration, right? So one of the things I worked on quite a lot in my time with NRDC was environmental public interest litigation. And to the Chinese state's credit, they sort of accepted that mechanism into put it into Chinese law, and it became a formal mechanism. But because of limits on the mechanism, limits on the power of the courts in China, and constraints on civil society room to grow and to fundraise and these sorts of things, the tool in practice has not been, done a tremendous amount in practice. There have been some high-profile cases, but it's not broadly, to my mind, where the action is, right? And so I think those are two dynamics, and I think the international groups are continuing to be very active, of partnering often with government and academics. There's less space for the domestic NGOs, although they still are there to sort of highlight problems, to provide kind of implementation of different services at the local level and that sort of thing. But I think it's I would love to see more room for civil society to grow in China, domestic environmental groups, and to play a greater role, because I think what they can really do is, just to give a few examples, they can temper some of the problems of a top-down approach, right? One of the issues that's cropped up in the last few years, it went from previously the critique of China was inaction on the environment. And then in some areas in the last few years, it's actually the critique has shifted to sort of overzealous implementation, or in Chinese they often call it like 一刀切 kind of implementation, like one size fits all implementation. And NGOs and public participation is a great way to mitigate that. To check if local officials who are just trying to meet targets and not actually meeting the actual objective of the policy. And so transparency and public participation remain important as checks on bad implementation.
Okay, so in the last few minutes here, I want to give you a chance to get a couple of other ideas out here. So we've talked some in the early part of our discussion about cooperation and the degree to which it's had some successes, has survived some tough times, has some problems, make it somewhat better. That's the cooperation story, but there are two other stories. One of which you've touched upon some, which is essentially the parallel play. That is, China and the U.S. do things more or less separately in a way that helps advance what we need to do on climate change. And that's very much the theme of your modest proposal paper that's part of the Penn Project on the Future of U.S.-China Relations. I put that in the chat box for everybody to click on. It's a terrific piece. I urge people to watch it or to read it. So if you can speak a little more first for the audience about China's self-interested reasons to do better on its own on climate change. You've alluded to some of those. And then to close this out, to take us into the subject of your other paper, is U.S.-China climate action possible in an era of mistrust? Is that out yet, by the way?
It's not out yet. The other piece is coming out in the Harvard is putting out a book called China Questions. They had one, and there's a China Questions 2 coming out later in the year, and this second piece will be in that book.
And so the second piece essentially says competition may be a way to help, competition between the U.S. and China may be a way to help advance those goals. So in the last few minutes here, I encourage you to go for that.
Yeah, so just to throw those ideas out there, the Penn piece that Jacques alluded to is just highlighting an argument that's not a surprise to anyone who's closely following this, but to just recognize that China has a lot of self-interested reasons to move. Specifically, I talk about moving away from coal in that piece, and in the piece I essentially just highlight the economic, environmental, and sort of reputational reasons that China is moving forward on climate change and would have an interest in moving away from coal, right? So part of this, the environmental effort is tightly linked in China to an overall project of economic transformation, right? Upgrading the economy, moving to higher quality growth, moving away from heavy industry to services and advanced manufacturing and clean tech and these sorts of things. And so the environmental measures help to push that. There was obviously a real environmental crisis that's being dealt with by these policies, and there was a reputational problem and challenge that was being dealt with by these policies. So that all of those create the high-level impetus for this. And to the extent that China has been pushing forward on the economic front to support these industries, the move into electric vehicles, wind, solar, these types of things, it's an effort of China to build strength in areas where there weren't long-standing incumbent actors, right? It's very hard to break into the internal combustion engine kind of auto field because you're way behind, right? And but China can make progress on EVs and clean tech and that sort of thing. And so that's the part of the dynamic in brief there. On the competition front, the point of that second piece is just to highlight that for all the talk about cooperation, there are increasingly these competitive dynamics driven by self-interest that will move the ball forward. That if we can prevent things from descending into this tit for tat we were talking about earlier, that the competition itself can drive things forward. And again, that's about the competition over the economic opportunities in these industries. The competition to use climate policy as a lever for building the international alliances. And then also, again, coming back to this issue of the kind of reputational competition, right? That is, I think it's particularly important to China, where the conventional view in the developed world is that there's something illegitimate about China's political model. And China is very strongly making the case that, look, we are as legitimate, if not more so, than you, liberal democracies, because our system performs and it can deliver on things like combating COVID or solving climate change or lifting people out of poverty, right? That's the message. And for the U.S. part, we're in a period where a lot of people are talking about democratic decline and political divisions, and now is an opportunity for the U.S. and Europe to show that liberal democratic states can solve the problem while being true to visions of participation and transparency and those sorts of things. And so that to me is a really interesting kind of more abstract, higher level issue, but I think it's real, and it's shaping the way we think about what is acceptable in the world. And those types of battles also affect the way we think about other issues, like it bleeds into the human rights debate. It bleeds into the way that China is dealing with Hong Kong and Taiwan and these sorts of things, right? And there's a way in which these all touch on each other and interact with each other.
Well, I think that's a great note to take us right up to the end here. It's a useful reminder of just how much all of these issues are interlinked, and why we've reached a stage in Americans studying and commenting on China that we all have to be in our own specialties to get any depth here, but it's important to get back up out of the pool every once in a while and talk about how all these issues are interlinked. Moments of great drama in that tend to be when you see changes in administrations, especially with different agendas, and we're seeing that now. We could go on all afternoon, but we promised to let Alex go, and we promised to let the rest of you go on with your days, so I'll close with just a couple of things. First, thanking Alex Wang for a terrific discussion. I mean, really insightful on some big issues and some complex issues, which he did a great job of making accessible without sacrificing reality and insight and all that. And I'll put in a plug for what we've got going forward in the FPRI Asia program Zoom webinars. We will be on April 29th at 2 p.m., same time slot here, our Thursday 2 o'clock time slot. We do a lot of these with Avery Goldstein, my colleague at Penn, and me. We're going to be talking about our edited volume from Brookings, which is coming out right around then, called After Engagement, Dilemmas in U.S. China Security Relations, kind of an all-star cast of contributing authors, and we'll be discussing what's in that book. It speaks to obliquely to some of the themes that we touched upon here today around the fringes of our environmental discussion. The other thing, which I am compelled to say and happy to say, is if you enjoyed today's program, please consider making a donation to FPRI or becoming a member. The details are available on the FPRI website. And last but far from least, once again, thanks to Alex, and I commend to your reading his piece that's on the Penn Project website that's been put in the chat there, and we'll let you know when his piece in the Harvard China Questions series comes out. Thank you all again. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks a lot, Jacques, and thanks to everyone for listening.